there, and welcome to the newest installment of The Truth is Out There. My name is Michelle Ziegler, and I will be showing you today information on unconscious bias. So for today, if you're on the library's homepage, we're going to be going to find the subject guide that's been created for it. So if you actually go under Resources and find Subject Guides, you can select it right there. And if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll see Truth is Out There. And today we're going to be looking at unconscious bias. So this guide I created is talking about what unconscious bias is, or as some of you may know it as implicit bias. But essentially, basically, unconscious bias is having these stereotypical and biased viewpoints and thoughts that maybe you're unaware of because unconsciously they're happening in your mind all the time, right? So some examples of what unconscious or implicit bias might be is favoring certain names over others. So a lot of research has actually been done that found that employees are less likely to hire applicants depending on what their name sounds like, whether it sounds Asian or it sounds more African American. Employers actually won't hire them or won't even often look at their resumes, for instance. And that's without even seeing the applicant. That's just seeing their name. We also have evidence of having unconscious bias if you have positive or negative feelings based upon someone's race. So there's actually a lot of data showing that medical professionals have a great deal of implicit racial bias. And in one particular study, there was actually evidence that showed they not only had implicit bias towards African American adults, but also children. So after they were looking at images of both black and white portraits of people, they associated more positive words to white individuals over black individuals, just based upon looking at the image and what their face looked like. Another example of unconscious bias would be valuing someone more for their similarity towards yourself. So if you happen to be male, you may, if you happen to be male or identify as male, you may be more likely to want to work with someone that's male or choose someone male over female, right? So another recent study showed that when it comes to job referrals, women in companies and corporations are more likely to select females in job referrals over males when they've been referred for a certain job. So that's another example. But unconscious bias can be found in many different ways, and these are just a couple of examples of that. If you scroll up, I have a tab that actually shows some books and ebooks the library offers that have some more information about unconscious bias and how to notice it, how to deal with it, and just different perspectives as well of dealing with bias in general. And then I have a tab that talks about research and bias. So just like I was talking previously about some of the examples of unconscious bias, these are other just a small selection of the many research articles that have been written and studied upon the subject of implicit and unconscious bias. And so I've organized them by race, gender, sexuality, and the intersections between them. So there's been implicit bias not only with black women, not only with black individuals, but also black women, for instance. Race and gender are one that happen a lot together, for instance. But there's also sexuality. That's another thing I haven't touched upon yet, is that there's a lot of bias depending on sexual orientation as well. And you can look at any one of these different articles and you can click on them, which will take you to the record of the article where you can get more information and view a PDF of the text if you want more information on it. And then there's also a tab that I've organized about biases in artificial intelligence. So this is one thing that's being talked about more and more often, is that we are actually seeing in programming, in technology, that technology can actually be biased. So an example of this is doing a Google image search. This is an easy and simple example that a lot of people often do, which is to do a Google image search for something very general. Typically a profession is a good one, for instance, and just to see what you get in those results. So studies have shown that in search engines and in artificial intelligence, they're very biased in their search results and what those search results show, especially within imaging. So 2 examples I did here today were for Googling CEOs and Googling librarians. So already I can see that the majority of results are primarily white individuals. They're not very diverse. You can also see that in the CEO Google search, it not only is it very white, but it's also very male. To counter that, in the librarian Google image search, while it's not as diverse as far as race is concerned, you also see more women than men. And this is going with unconscious bias and that stereotype that we have. So often we would stereotype librarians as being primarily female, when in fact, there are many men that are librarians. Same thing for CEOs. We might assume that most CEOs not only are male, but are white males. But, that is not the case, and that we should be seeing more diverse individuals in these search results, but we're not. So a fun activity is to play around with this. Some other ones that I've done, for instance, include looking at doctors. Are we seeing diverse doctors in image searching? Are we seeing diverse architects? Are we seeing diverse firefighters, for instance? That's another interesting one. It's also interesting looking at the comparison between men and women. So, for instance, one study I believe I read was looking at searching for firefighters, but when you specify looking for female firefighters, the images are skewed in the sense that they're not very professional. So when we search generally for firefighters, we're seeing more men, but men at work, right? Men in the field. But when we search for specifically female firefighters, we are seeing very sexualized images of women in not professional clothing. Typically it's not accurate, it's fake, it's costumes, it's not being taken seriously, even though we know that there are female firefighters that exist and that they would not be dressing that way. So it's biased in the sense of viewing women in a sexual way. But then I've also included some information about why artificial intelligence specifically is failing us. So this, with the Google image search, is just a very small example, but implicit bias and unconscious bias is present in many different ways, and that includes facial recognition, data collection, and even health algorithms, which is a really big one and a really concerning one. So for instance, healthcare systems use algorithms that basically categorize people and categorize data, and one such study found that they were actually excluding Black patients from their algorithm. And the way that they were doing that was because they were looking at health costs and how that coordinated with health needs. And since less money was spent on Black patients, despite the fact they have the same level of need, the algorithm falsely concluded that Black patients are healthier than actually sick white patients. So there were Black patients that perhaps weren't getting the needs that they needed and were being categorized as being healthy when they were in fact not, which is a really big concern. And that's just one of the many examples of implicit bias that can be seen in the medical field. And it's really big and it's being talked about a lot, but that's just one example of many concerns there. We also see with artificial intelligence in the sense of facial recognition. One example was that transgender drivers are being forced out of driving apps such as Uber because you're required to identify yourself with a photograph. But if your photograph doesn't match what you currently look like, for instance, then you're unable to be a driver. And many transgendered people as they go through a transition, they might not look the same as they looked previously. And due to that implicit bias through the programming, it's not recognizing those individuals and who they are as people. And that's a huge issue that needs to be addressed, that we need to actively look at when we're designing programs and that sort of thing. So while artificial intelligence may seem like a really great technology, we have to look at the details within it. How are they categorizing people, and what data are they collecting, and if it's accurate or not. And then I've also included some links on the side that give more detail about these types of things. Under videos and TED Talks, there's more information about understanding unconscious bias. There's a really quick video that does a really great job of just explaining it in a very simplified manner. We've also have some really interesting TED Talks that talk more about biases and how to deal with implicit bias and unconscious bias. And then finally, I've included some additional resources. So how to deal and reduce implicit bias for yourself. So I've included just some general guidelines to help you. So one example is just to test yourself. Before I had actually done the Harvard's implicit association test, I didn't really recognize that maybe I had implicit bias. It's a very interesting test, and it's free, and I suggest anyone to take it because it really makes you recognize that implicit bias is a real thing, and it is something we should be talking more about and identifying, but you can't identify it until you see it within yourself, right? But then also to educate. So there are classes and workshops that are always available about unconscious and implicit bias that you can take online. I'm sure that there are some in public places that you can visit as well, but I've included right now the Kerwin Institute, which currently offers free modules about implicit bias training that are available. But then lastly, another way of reducing this is by speaking up. So if you want to, you should be an advocate. You should speak out. There are a lot of different colleges and universities, but also corporations and jobs that are now requiring implicit bias training. And if this is something that you're not seeing within your institution or you're not seeing within your job, you should talk about it. You should ask about it and say, this is something I think that should be required because it's affecting people. It's something that we should identify, and without that training, we can't identify it. So speak up about it and try to see if you can get your job or your school on board with that. And then in addition, I've included some other links that are very interesting and helpful from the New York Times. So if you haven't checked out the rest of the information on the guide, please do. But hopefully this has given you more information about the truth of unconscious bias, what unconscious bias means, and how you can look out for it yourself. So if you have any other information or any other questions that you'd like answered, you can always come to the library or speak to one of us. We also have 24/7 chat service that's available if you have any questions on this or anything else. Thank you for attending The Truth is Out There, and have a great day.